the undesirable island. By late May 1944, the tide of the Pacific War had irrevocably turned against the Empire of Japan. The Marianas Islands, particularly Saipan, were falling, a catastrophic event that placed Japan's home islands within range of America's new superbomber, the Boeing B-29 Superfortress. From the Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, the strategic calculus was grim. A desperate search began for men who could stem the tide, or at least make the inevitable American advance so costly as to be unbearable. On May 27, 1944, a summons was issued for Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. At 53, Kuribayashi was an anomaly within the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Japanese Army, IJA. He was an aristocrat, a former cavalryman, a poet, and, most dangerously, a man who knew America. He had spent 2 years in the 1920s as a military attaché in Washington, D.C., and had traveled extensively across the country. He had seen the sprawling factories of Detroit, the endless fields of the Midwest, and the sheer industrial might that dwarfed Japan's capacity. Unlike his peers who dismissed the Americans as soft and materialistic, Kuribayashi harbored no such illusions. He understood their industrial power, their logistical genius, and their grim determination once provoked. This knowledge made him both an invaluable asset and a quiet Cassandra, his warnings of American power often falling on deaf ears. When he was ushered into the presence of Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, the mission was laid bare. He was to take command of the 109th Division and defend Iwo Jima. It was a death sentence, and both men knew it. Iwo Jima, Sulphur Island, was a desolate volcanic outcrop, devoid of fresh water, plagued by sulfuric fumes, and of seemingly little value. But its geography was now its destiny. Lying halfway between the Marianas and Tokyo, its 2 airfields were a critical prize. In Japanese hands, they were a base for fighters to harass the B-29s. In American hands, they would provide fighter escorts for those same bombers and an emergency landing strip for crippled aircraft. Kuribayashi accepted the post without protest. Before leaving for the island in early June, he was granted a rare audience with Emperor Hirohito. While the details of their conversation remain secret, it is believed the emperor personally tasked him with defending this vital stepping stone. As he bowed to his emperor, Kuribayashi was not just accepting a command, he was accepting his own death and the deaths of the 21,000 men he would soon lead. His final words to his wife, Yoshii, were steeped in the fatalism of his class: "Do not expect my return." He was now bound to the black sands of a volcanic hell. Want to know more than what's in the textbooks? Subscribe to World War II, Unfiltered, and join our community of history explorers. Your likes and comments help the channel grow. A Doctrine of Defiance. Upon his arrival on Iwo Jima on June 8, 1944, General Kuribayashi conducted a meticulous survey of the island's defenses and was appalled. The preparations were conventional, lazy, and utterly suicidal. The existing plan followed the standard Japanese doctrine for island defense: build fortifications along the coastline, meet the enemy on the beaches, and, when defeat was imminent, launch a glorious Banzai charge, a mass human wave attack driven by samurai spirit. Kuribayashi saw this for what it was: wasteful, ineffective, and strategically bankrupt. It played directly into the hands of American naval firepower. From his time in America, he knew the U.S. Marines would not be repulsed by spirit alone. They would be preceded by a sledgehammer of naval bombardment and airstrikes that would obliterate any beach defense before the first landing craft hit the sand. He immediately ordered a radical and deeply unpopular shift in strategy, one that went against the grain of the IJA's entire Bushido-infused ethos. His new orders were shocking in their pragmatism. First, there would be no more Banzai charges. He deemed them a useless waste of life. Every soldier's life was a resource to be expended with maximum efficiency. The goal was not a glorious, swift death but a prolonged, ugly, and costly defense. Second, the defense would not be centered on the beaches. Instead, the entire island was to be turned into a massive, multi-layered fortress in depth. The main line of resistance would be inland, away from the devastating reach of naval guns. Third, and most crucially, the defense would be subterranean. Kuribayashi envisioned a vast, interconnected network of tunnels, bunkers, and fighting positions carved directly into the island's soft volcanic rock. This would protect his men from the inevitable pre-invasion bombardment and allow them to fight from concealed, mutually supporting positions. His core tactical principle was simple and brutal: we will build our fortifications underground, and from them we will rain death upon the invaders. This philosophy was met with fierce, albeit quiet, resistance from his subordinate officers, who were steeped in the tradition of offensive, shock-action warfare. They saw his methods as cowardly and defensive. Kuribayashi, combining his aristocratic authority with unyielding logic, crushed this dissent. He established a set of core precepts for every soldier on the island, known as the courageous battle vows, which were posted in every bunker. Among them, each man will make it his duty to kill 10 of the enemy before dying. There was to be no surrender, but also no pointless sacrifice. Every death was to have a price, and that price was 10 American lives. Forging the fortress. With his strategy set, Kuribayashi became a relentless taskmaster, driving his men in a desperate race against time. The primary tool for his grand design was the island itself. Iwo Jima's volcanic ash, while easy to dig, was soft and prone to collapse. To counter this, tunnels had to be reinforced with timber, concrete, and scavenged steel. The work was hellish. Soldiers, primarily from the 145th Infantry Regiment and naval engineers, toiled around the clock in suffocating heat, often exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit 50 degrees Celsius, their air thick with choking sulfuric dust. Water was strictly rationed, barely enough to sustain life, let alone hard labor. Kuribayashi was not a distant commander. He personally walked the island daily, inspecting progress, offering technical advice. His engineering knowledge was considerable, and sharing the hardships of his men. This hands-on approach, unusual for a Japanese general, slowly won over his skeptical subordinates and fostered a fierce sense of loyalty among the enlisted men. They saw that their commander was not asking anything of them that he was not enduring himself. The scale of the project was staggering. The ultimate plan called for over 18 miles, 29 kilometers, of tunnels. The northern part of the island, around the Motoyama Plateau and Airfield No. 2, became the main defensive zone, a honeycomb of command posts, barracks, ammunition depots, and hospitals, all buried deep underground. The island's dominant geographical feature, the 554-foot Mount Suribachi at the southern tip, was transformed into its own independent fortress. Its slopes were riddled with hundreds of concealed gun positions, blockhouses, and observation posts, all connected by a complex web of tunnels, giving its defenders the ability to fire on the landing beaches from every conceivable angle and then disappear back into the mountain. Kuribayashi's tactical genius was in the design of the firing positions. He forbade his men from firing on the landing craft until the beaches were packed with men and equipment. Then, and only then, would the trap be sprung. Every artillery piece, every heavy mortar, every machine gun was pre-sighted on specific kill zones on the beaches and the plateaus beyond. Pillboxes were not built to face the sea directly but were angled, enfilade, to fire down the length of the beaches, creating inescapable crossfires. He turned Iwo Jima from a barren island into a single, integrated weapon system, with his 21,000 men as its living, breathing components, all waiting in the suffocating darkness for the storm to break. The arsenal of attrition. A fortress, no matter how well designed, is useless without the teeth to bite. Kuribayashi and his staff, particularly the gifted artillery officer Colonel Chosaku Kaido, meticulously planned the emplacement of every weapon on the island. Their arsenal, while not as plentiful as they wished, was formidable and cleverly used. The backbone of the defense consisted of over 360 artillery pieces of 75 mm caliber or greater. These were not massed in open batteries as traditional doctrine dictated. Instead, they were dispersed and individually concealed in deep, reinforced casemates carved into the rock, with only small, camouflaged apertures for their barrels. This made them nearly impossible to spot from the air or sea and highly resistant to all but a direct hit from the heaviest naval shells. Alongside the artillery, Kuribayashi had a fearsome collection of over 200 heavy mortars, 150 mm and 81 mm. He knew these high-arcing weapons were perfect for dropping explosive shells onto troops taking cover behind the island's terraced terrain. Perhaps most terrifying were the rockets. Kuribayashi had dozens of 200mm and 400mm spigot mortars, which fired enormous, inaccurate but psychologically devastating projectiles. The American Marines would later nickname them screaming memes or buzz bombs, their sheer explosive power capable of obliterating entire squads. The infantry were armed with standard Arisaka rifles, but their strength lay in the machine guns. Over 900 light and heavy machine guns were placed in interlocking fields of fire, often in concrete pillboxes with walls several feet thick. Kuribayashi even had a handful of tanks from the 26th Tank Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Takechi Nishi. Baron Nishi, a former Olympic gold medalist in equestrian events, was another aristocratic officer who, like Kuribayashi, understood the futility of conventional tactics. Instead of using his tanks in a mobile counterattack where they would be quickly destroyed, he had them dug into the ground in hold-down positions, effectively turning them into static armored pillboxes, their 47mm cannons adding to the deadly crossfire aimed at the designated kill zones. Every weapon was positioned not for a decisive battle, but for a prolonged, agonizing war of attrition. The entire system was designed to allow a position to be defended, abandoned when overwhelmed, and then reoccupied by troops moving through the tunnel network, creating a nightmarish, three-dimensional battlefield where an enemy that seemed defeated could spring back to life at any moment. The mind of the commander. To understand the defense of Iwo Jima is to understand the mind of Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was not a one-dimensional fanatic, but a complex figure, a warrior, a poet, a husband, and a father. Throughout his time on the island, he maintained a steady correspondence with his wife, Yoshii, and his son, Taro. These letters, recovered after the war, provide an unparalleled window into his thoughts and motivations. They are devoid of the jingoistic rhetoric common among his peers. Instead, they reveal a man acutely aware of his fate, burdened by his responsibility, and filled with a deep love for his family. He wrote of the miserable conditions, the lack of water, the constant American bombing raids that began in late 1944, and his deep-seated loneliness. "Do not think about me too much," he wrote to his wife, "think of me as dead, and do not be surprised when you hear of my death." In another letter to his son, he urged him to study hard and not follow him into the military, a stunning admission from a career IJA general. This personal humanity stood in stark contrast to the brutal calculus of his professional duty. He understood the American mindset better than any other Japanese general in the Pacific. He knew they prized individual lives, and he weaponized this knowledge. His strategy was a form of psychological warfare. It was designed to inflict not just casualties, but horror. He wanted the cost of Iwo Jima to be so shocking, so viscerally unacceptable to the American public, that their government might hesitate to invade the Japanese mainland. From his underground command post, located 75 feet deep in the northern part of the island, he prepared his final testament. It was not a poem or a letter, but the island fortress itself. As the American invasion fleet, the largest yet assembled in the Pacific, gathered on the horizon in mid-February 1945, Kuribayashi knew his work was complete. He had forged a crucible. He had no illusions of victory, no hope of survival. His sole remaining purpose was to choreograph a defense so savage and costly that the echoes of its violence would reach the negotiating tables and perhaps, in some small way, save the homeland from utter destruction. The architect was ready to see his devilish masterpiece tested by fire. The Unholy Tempest. On February 16, 1945, the storm broke. For 3 days, the U.S. Navy subjected Iwo Jima to the most concentrated naval bombardment of the Pacific War. Rear Admiral William H.P. Blandy's Task Force 52, a flotilla of battleships, heavy cruisers, and destroyers, unleashed a relentless torrent of steel. Thousands of shells, ranging from massive 16-inch projectiles from battleships like the USS Tennessee and Nevada to the ubiquitous 5-inch rounds from destroyers, pounded the 8-square-mile island. The Navy's objective was to soften the island, to obliterate all surface defenses and demoralize the garrison. From the air, B-24 Liberator bombers flying from the Marianas joined the assault, dropping tons of high explosives. To an observer on the command ship USS Estes, the island appeared to be erupting, vanishing under a constant shroud of smoke, fire, and geysers of black ash. American planners, confident in the overwhelming power of their armada, believed that no defense could possibly withstand such a sustained cataclysm. Some intelligence officers boldly predicted the island would be secured in as little as 3 or 4 days. They were catastrophically wrong. Deep within their subterranean labyrinth, Kuribayashi and his men waited. The ground heaved, the air compressed with each concussive blast, and dust filled the tunnels, but the fortress held. Kuribayashi's fundamental insight, that surface defenses were obsolete against modern naval firepower, was being proven correct. The bombardment, while terrifying, was largely ineffective against his deeply buried, reinforced positions. It churned the surface of the island, rearranging the volcanic ash, but failed to penetrate the core of his defensive network. It was loud, violent, and ultimately, a prelude that did little to weaken the true strength of the garrison. Kuribayashi had forbidden his artillery to return fire. To do so would be to reveal their positions prematurely and invite pinpoint destruction. The silence from the island was misinterpreted by some in the American command as evidence of the bombardment's success. In reality, it was the calculated discipline of a predator waiting for its prey to step into the killing zone. For 3 days, 21,000 men sat in the hot, suffocating darkness, listening to the world being torn apart above them, hoarding their ammunition and their hatred. Their patience was a weapon, sharpened by their commander. D-Day, the trap is sprung. At 9:02 on February 19, 1945, the ramps of the 1st Higgins boats dropped, and the men of the 4th and 5th Marine Divisions charged onto the black sand beaches of Iwo Jima. The initial moments were deceptively quiet. The naval bombardment had lifted, shifting inland, and for a few precious minutes, the only sound was the roar of the landing craft and the boots of thousands of Marines struggling across the shore. The terrain was the first enemy. The volcanic ash was not firm sand but soft, steep terraces that offered no traction and no cover. Heavily laden Marines sank up to their ankles, their progress agonizingly slow. The island was silent. For 15 minutes, the beaches grew more and more crowded as waves of landing craft disgorged thousands of men, tanks, and equipment, creating a dense, perfect target, just as Kuribayashi had planned. Then, from his command bunker, he gave the order. At approximately 9:17, the island erupted. It was not a chaotic barrage but a symphony of coordinated destruction. From the slopes of Mount Suribachi to the south and the high ground of the Motoyama Plateau to the north, hundreds of pre-sighted artillery pieces, mortars, and machine guns opened fire. Enfilading fire from camouflaged pillboxes tore horizontally across the beaches, creating inescapable killing fields. Mortar rounds and massive rocket bombs rained down from the sky, their explosions flipping vehicles and vaporizing entire squads of men. The carefully organized waves of the landing devolved into a desperate struggle for survival. Marines clawed at the soft ash, trying to dig foxholes that collapsed as quickly as they were dug. Medics became targets. Communication lines were shredded. The beach became a junkyard of burning vehicles, shattered landing craft, and dead and wounded men. The sheer, calculated violence was unlike anything the Marines, many of them veterans of previous campaigns, had ever experienced. They were not fighting an enemy on the beach, they were being systematically slaughtered by an invisible foe hidden within the island itself. Kuribayashi's trap had been sprung with devastating precision. The battle for Iwo Jima would not be a swift advance, it would be a bloody crawl, measured in yards and paid for in lives. The meat grinder. The first day set the tone for the entire battle, a brutal, frontal assault against a deeply entrenched, fanatical, and brilliantly led enemy. The primary objective for the assault's initial phase was to isolate the 554-foot Mount Suribachi from the rest of the island's defenses in the north. This task fell to the 28th Marine Regiment of the 5th Division. As they fought their way across the narrow southern neck of the island, they were savaged by fire from the fortress mountain. Every cave, every pillbox, every rocky crevice seemed to spit fire. The Japanese defenders, following Kuribayashi's orders to the letter, did not charge. They remained in their fortified positions, fighting until they were killed by flamethrowers, demolition charges, or grenades thrown into their tunnels. Progress was measured one strongpoint at a time. A Marine platoon would advance, using cover and suppressive fire to approach a Japanese pillbox. A flamethrower team, often the most vulnerable men on the battlefield, would rush forward to spew liquid fire into the firing slit, silencing the gun. Then, a demolition team would follow up, tossing satchel charges into the bunker to ensure no one inside survived. This grim process, blowtorch and corkscrew, was repeated hundreds of times. The Japanese defenders, in turn, used their tunnel network with deadly efficiency. A position that had just been cleared by the Marines could suddenly come back to life as Japanese soldiers emerged from a hidden tunnel entrance behind the American lines, sowing chaos and death before being gunned down. It was a three-dimensional battlefield. Death could come from the front, from behind, from above via mortars, or even from below, as Japanese soldiers would burst from spider holes concealed under a thin layer of ash. By the end of D-Day, the Marines had suffered nearly 2,500 casualties, including almost 600 killed. They had a tenuous foothold on the island, but they were nowhere near their objectives. The grim reality was setting in. Kuribayashi's strategy of attrition was working. The island was a meat grinder, and the Marines were being fed into it. The fall of Suribachi and the hollow victory. While the battle raged across the island, the fight to take Mount Suribachi became a battle within a battle. For 4 days, the 28th Marines clawed their way up the volcano's steep, treacherous slopes against ferocious resistance. The Japanese garrison on the mountain, commanded by Colonel Kanehiko Atsuchi, used their labyrinthine tunnels and hundreds of camouflaged firing positions to devastating effect. They rolled grenades down on the advancing Marines and swept the slopes with machine gun and rifle fire. Progress was slow and costly. Finally, on the morning of February 23, 1945, after days of intense fighting, a 40-man combat patrol from Easy Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, reached the summit. At 10:20 a.m., they raised a small American flag. The sight of the flag fluttering atop the highest point on the island sent a wave of elation through the American forces on the beaches and the ships at sea. Ships' horns blared and men cheered. It was a powerful moment of triumph in a sea of carnage. Recognizing the morale value of the event, a larger flag was ordered to be raised. It was this second flag raising, photographed by Joe Rosenthal of the Associated Press, that would become one of the most iconic images of the 20th century. However, the symbolic victory of taking Suribachi masked a brutal truth. The fall of the mountain did not signal the end of the battle, it was merely the end of the beginning. Kuribayashi had never intended Suribachi to hold out indefinitely. He had designated it as a semi-independent sector, expecting it to be cut off and reduced. The bulk of his forces, over 2/3 of his men and his most powerful fortifications, were concentrated in the north. The flag on Suribachi represented the capture of less than a quarter of the island. The bloodiest fighting was yet to come. As the Marines consolidated their hold on the volcano, they began the grim task of clearing out the hundreds of caves and tunnels, a process that would continue for days, with Japanese soldiers emerging sporadically to fight to the death. The architect of the defense had sacrificed his southern fortress, exacting a heavy price, all to draw the main American force into the far deadlier, interlocking defenses of the Motoyama Plateau. Nishi's last stand, the Baron and his tanks. With Suribachi secured, the full weight of the 3 Marine divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th, turned north, pushing into the main belt of Kuribayashi's defenses. Here, the terrain was a defender's dream, a hellish landscape of rocky ridges, canyons, and gorges that the Marines would come to call the amphitheater, Turkey Knob, and, most infamously, the meat grinder. It was here that Lieutenant Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, the Olympic champion, made his stand with the 26th Tank Regiment. True to Kuribayashi's strategy, Nishi had buried his Type 97 Chiha and Type 95 Hago tanks, using them as static artillery and anti-tank pillboxes. Their 47mm and 37mm cannons were cleverly sighted to cover the approaches to Airfield No. 2 and the surrounding high ground. Nishi established his command post in a large cave system near the village of Merriman, surrounded by his dismounted tank crews who now fought as elite infantry. For nearly a week, Nishi's sector held out against determined Marine assaults. His buried tanks, perfectly camouflaged and mutually supporting, took a heavy toll on the advancing infantry and their Sherman tanks. The American M4 Sherman, with its 75mm gun, was a superior tank, but finding Nishi's well-hidden positions was a deadly challenge. Nishi, who had been a celebrity in both Japan and the West before the war, directed his defense with skill and tenacity. He was reportedly wounded by machine gun fire midway through the battle but continued to command. As the American vice tightened, his position became untenable. Communications with Kuribayashi's headquarters were cut. On or around March 22, with his position overrun and most of his men dead, Baron Nishi met his end. The exact circumstances are debated. Some accounts say he committed ritual suicide, seppuku. Others claim he was killed leading a final, desperate charge out of his cave with his surviving men. Whatever the truth, the aristocratic equestrian who had once charmed Hollywood society died as a ferocious warrior, a testament to the strange and varied collection of men Kuribayashi had inspired. His death marked the fall of another major defensive hub, but the island continued to bleed the Americans for every yard gained. The northern labyrinth and the meat grinder. With the southern third of the island secured, the three Marine divisions began their slow, agonizing pivot north. They were now entering the heart of Kuribayashi's defensive masterpiece. This was not a linear battlefield but a chaotic, three-dimensional killing ground. The terrain itself was a weapon. The northern plateau was a nightmarish landscape of volcanic ridges, crags, and draws, further mangled by the naval bombardment into a maze of shattered rock and soft ash. Key terrain features were given grim, descriptive names by the Marines who had to assault them: the amphitheater, a natural bowl-shaped depression, Turkey Knob, a fortified hillock that commanded the amphitheater, and a complex of interlocking positions simply and accurately dubbed the meat grinder. This area, defended by some of Kuribayashi's best troops, embodied his entire strategic concept. It was a dense network of mutually supporting pillboxes, blockhouses, and hidden mortar pits, all interconnected by a web of tunnels. Taking one position was useless, as it was immediately covered by fire from three others. Assaults that gained ground during the day were often rendered meaningless overnight, as Japanese troops would use their tunnels to reoccupy supposedly cleared bunkers, or emerge behind Marine lines to attack command posts and casualty collection points. The fighting devolved into a brutal, yard-by-yard struggle. Flamethrower tanks, like the Sherman M4A3 or 3 Zippo, became one of the most effective and horrifying tools. These machines could project a stream of jellied gasoline over 100 yards, incinerating the occupants of a pillbox without requiring a direct assault by vulnerable infantry. Yet, for every bunker neutralized, another would open fire. The psychological toll was immense. Marines lived in a state of constant, high-alert paranoia. Sleep was impossible. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere at once. Casualties mounted at an unsustainable rate. Entire companies were rendered combat ineffective in a single day's fighting. The battle for the meat grinder, which raged from late February into early March, was the epitome of attrition warfare, a bloody equation where the only variable was the number of bodies, American and Japanese, required to purchase each square foot of hellish rock. The technology of a close-quarters war. The battle for Iwo Jima became a grim proving ground for the technology of close-quarters combat. While naval guns and strategic bombers initiated the conflict, its resolution depended on the weapons that individual soldiers and Marines could carry into a cave or bunker. On the American side, the M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle, BAR, provided superior semi-automatic firepower against the Japanese bolt-action Arisaka. However, the most decisive infantry weapons were those of demolition and annihilation. The M2 flamethrower, though terrifyingly dangerous for its operator, was brutally effective at clearing enclosed spaces. A single burst into a pillbox aperture could consume all the oxygen, killing the occupants by asphyxiation even if the flames didn't reach them. Hand grenades were used by the crate load. Demolition teams armed with satchel charges filled with TNT became the key to unlocking the Japanese defense. They were the only reliable method for collapsing a bunker and sealing its occupants inside. Conversely, the Japanese arsenal was perfectly suited for Kuribayashi's defensive strategy. The Type 89 knee mortar, a misnomer, as firing it from the knee would shatter the bone, was a light, highly portable grenade discharger that could arc small explosive shells with pinpoint accuracy over ridges and into marine foxholes, making it one of the most feared weapons on the island. Their extensive use of the Type 99 magnetic mine, designed to be attached to the hull of a tank, forced marine infantry to closely screen their armor at all times. But the true Japanese technology was the tunnel network itself. It was a force multiplier, allowing a numerically inferior force to concentrate its strength at critical points, to bypass enemy lines, to store vast quantities of ammunition and supplies safe from bombardment, and to allow defenders to fight, retreat, and re-engage in an endless, horrifying loop. It transformed a conventional assault into a series of simultaneous sieges against hundreds of microscopic, subterranean fortresses. The battle was ultimately won not by overwhelming technology, but by the willingness of individual Marines to close with and destroy these positions one by one, using the most basic and brutal tools of war. The whispers of George Wood, Intelligence and Its Limits. While the Marines on Iwo Jima were locked in a desperate struggle, intelligence officers in Washington and Pearl Harbor were sifting through a trove of priceless information from one of the most important and least-known spies of the war, Fritz Kolbe, codenamed George Wood. Kolbe was a mid-level official in the German Foreign Ministry who, disgusted by the Nazi regime, had begun smuggling top-secret documents to Allen Dulles, the OSS station chief in Bern, Switzerland. These documents included German diplomatic cables, intelligence reports, and, crucially, dispatches from the Japanese ambassador in Berlin, General Hiroshi Oshima. Oshima often transmitted highly detailed reports on Japanese military strategy and thinking back to Tokyo, using German communication channels that were considered secure. Through this pipeline, the Americans gained an unprecedented, if sometimes incomplete, insight into Japanese plans. They learned about the shift in defensive doctrine away from beach defenses toward defense in depth. They had some inkling of the massive underground fortifications being constructed on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa. However, intelligence, no matter how good, has its limits. While the strategic overview provided by George Wood and other sources like Ultra Codebreakers was invaluable, it could not convey the tactical reality on the ground. The intelligence could say there are extensive underground fortifications, but it could not adequately prepare a Marine for the psychological shock of seeing a dozen supposedly destroyed pillboxes spring back to life. The pre-invasion assessment by the V Amphibious Corps, VAC, intelligence staff severely underestimated the number of defenders and, more importantly, the sheer scale and sophistication of Kuribayashi's tunnel network. They failed to appreciate how the system integrated every weapon into a single, cohesive defensive organism. This intelligence failure was not born of incompetence, but of an inability to truly comprehend the fanaticism and brilliant engineering they were about to face. Kuribayashi had created something new, a fortress so unique in its design that existing intelligence paradigms could not fully grasp its lethality until it was experienced firsthand, at a terrible cost in blood. The Code Talker's unbreakable shield. Amidst the cacophony of explosions, gunfire, and screams, a strange and melodic language could be heard crackling over the Marine Corps' radio nets. It was the sound of the Navajo Code Talkers, one of the most powerful secret weapons in the American arsenal. In the brutal chaos of Iwo Jima, where communication lines were constantly being cut and radios were essential, secure and rapid communication was a matter of life and death. Traditional cryptographic machines were too slow and cumbersome for the fluid, fast-paced horror of the front lines. The Japanese had proven themselves to be exceptionally skilled at intercepting and deciphering American communications, often calling in devastatingly accurate artillery strikes on positions revealed by radio chatter. To counter this, the Marines employed several hundred Navajo men who had been specially recruited for the purpose. Their complex, unwritten language, with its unique syntax and tonal qualities, was utterly incomprehensible to outsiders. The Code Talkers further enhanced the security by developing a coded vocabulary within their own language. A submarine became Beshlo, iron fish, a battleship became Lotso, whale, and the island of Iwo Jima itself was referred to as Tingloai, bird animal guts. During the first 48 hours of the battle for Iwo Jima, a team of 6 Navajo code talkers, working around the clock, sent and received over 800 messages without a single error. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division's signal officer, stated, "Were it not for the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. Their work was flawlessly secure and incredibly fast. A message that would take a code machine 30 minutes to encrypt, transmit, and decrypt could be conveyed by a code talker in under 20 seconds. They directed artillery fire, reported enemy movements, coordinated troop advances, and called for medical evacuations, all under the noses of Japanese intelligence who, despite their best efforts, could never break the code. It was a perfect weapon, a shield of language that saved countless American lives and provided the tactical cohesion necessary to prosecute the bloody, grinding assault on Kuribayashi's fortress. The final days, no surrender. By mid-March, the battle had entered its final, ghastly phase. The organized defense began to fracture, but the fighting became no less intense. The surviving Japanese soldiers, now isolated in small pockets of resistance in the island's northernmost ravines and caves, followed Kuribayashi's first and last order, fight to the death. There were no mass surrenders, no white flags. Each cave had to be cleared with flamethrowers and explosives. The remaining defenders, starving, dehydrated, and often wounded, fought on with a fanaticism that stunned the battle-hardened Marines. On the night of March 8, a force of several hundred Japanese naval troops, cut off from Kuribayashi's command, launched a massive attack near the Cushman's Pocket area. Mistaken by some as a Banzai charge, it was in fact a well-coordinated, though suicidal, infiltration attack aimed at causing maximum disruption in the American rear. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand combat in the darkness that lasted for hours and cost both sides dearly. General Kuribayashi himself was still alive, directing the final defense from a shifting series of command posts in the north. His last known communication with Tokyo was on March 21. His message was stark: "We have not eaten or drunk for 5 days. But our fighting spirit is still high. We are going to fight bravely to the last." The exact date and circumstances of his death remain a mystery, a final act of defiance from a commander who wished to deny his enemy the prize of capturing him. It is believed that on the night of March 25, Kuribayashi, having removed his general's insignia to die as a common soldier, personally led his last few hundred able-bodied men in a final, silent attack. They emerged from their caves and infiltrated American lines near Airfield No. 2, surprising Army and Marine Service troops. In the ensuing melee, which lasted until morning, Kuribayashi was killed. His body was never definitively identified. He simply vanished back into the island he had transformed, his final resting place known only to the volcanic rock he had commanded. On March 26, 1945, 36 days after the invasion, the island was declared secure. But even then, the fighting wasn't over. For weeks, hundreds of Japanese soldiers would continue to emerge from the tunnels at night to scavenge and kill, a ghostly postscript to one of the most brutal battles in human history. The butcher's bill, a victory's terrible price. When the guns finally fell silent, the true cost of Kuribayashi's strategy was laid bare. Iwo Jima was the only battle in the entire Pacific campaign where American casualties exceeded those of the Japanese. The numbers were staggering and unprecedented. The Marine Corps suffered 26,038 total casualties, a figure that represented nearly a third of all Marines killed and wounded during the entire Second World War. Of those, 6,821 were killed in action or died of their wounds. The 3rd, 4th, and 5th Marine Divisions were shattered as effective fighting forces, requiring months of rest and reinforcement. The 5th Division alone sustained over 60% casualties. For context, the 36-day battle for this tiny island inflicted more American combat deaths than the entire Guadalcanal campaign, which lasted 6 months. This grim statistic was a direct testament to the success of Kuribayashi's doctrine of attrition. His goal was never to win, but to bleed America, and in this, he had succeeded beyond anyone's darkest imagination. For the Japanese, the cost was total annihilation. Of the estimated 21,000 to 22,000 defenders on the island, only 1,083 were captured alive, and many of those were taken unconscious or in the final days of the battle. The rest, over 20,000 men, were dead, entombed in the tunnels and bunkers they had built and defended so fiercely. Kuribayashi had achieved his goal of exacting a price of 10 American casualties for every Japanese soldier, but the final ratio was closer to 1.25 American casualties for every Japanese defender killed or captured, a grim and Pyrrhic victory in attrition. The battle's ferocity is also captured in the awarding of medals of honor. 27 were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, 13 posthumously, more than for any other single battle in American history. This unprecedented number of awards for supreme valor was a direct reflection of the unprecedented ferocity and courage required to overcome Kuribayashi's fortress. The island had been won, but the price paid for its 8 square miles would haunt the American military and public for generations. Economic and home front reverberations. The news from Iwo Jima sent a shockwave through the American home front. While propaganda posters and newsreels celebrated the iconic flag raising on Suribachi as a symbol of inevitable victory, the casualty lists that began appearing in local newspapers told a different story. For a nation that had been at war for over 3 years, the sheer brutality of the Iwo Jima casualty figures was profoundly shocking. Why, so late in the war when victory seemed assured, was the fighting becoming more, not less, costly? The battle became a focal point for the growing dread of the final invasion of Japan. Military planners, extrapolating from the Iwo Jima ratio, produced terrifying projections for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the Japanese home islands. Estimates varied, but many predicted American casualties could range from 500,000 to over 1 million. Kuribayashi's ghost was at the table. His strategy had successfully planted a seed of doubt and horror in the American consciousness. This psychological impact was a crucial, if unquantifiable, factor in the momentous decision that was looming. On the Japanese home front, the fall of Iwo Jima was a devastating blow. It was the first piece of sacred Japanese soil, administered as part of the Tokyo prefecture, to be captured by the enemy. Propaganda had assured the people of the garrison's invincibility. Its loss, despite the heroic narrative spun by the military, signaled that the enemy was now at the very doorstep of the homeland. For the dwindling peace faction within the Japanese government, the loss of Iwo Jima and the impending fall of Okinawa were further proof of the futility of continuing the war. Conversely, for the hardline militarists, the heavy American casualties proved that the Ketsugo strategy, a national version of Kuribayashi's defense, turning the entire population into a suicidal defense force, could work. The battle thus polarized the Japanese leadership, simultaneously fueling the arguments for both peace and for a final, apocalyptic battle to the death. Strategic aftermath, a stepping stone or a bloodbath. In the immediate aftermath, the strategic value of Iwo Jima became a subject of fierce debate within the U.S. military, a debate that continues among historians to this day. The official justification for the invasion was twofold: to eliminate the island as a base for Japanese fighters harassing B-29 raids and to gain its airfields as a base for American P-51 Mustang fighters to escort those same bombers. The second, and more publicized, reason was to have the island serve as an emergency landing field for crippled B-29s returning from raids on Japan. This second rationale was heavily promoted to justify the horrific casualties. By the end of the war, 2,251 B-29s had made emergency landings on Iwo Jima, and it was claimed that the 24,761 crewmen aboard were saved by the island's capture. This narrative, while emotionally powerful, is complex. The Navy and some historians have argued that the island's role as a fighter base was not essential, as later model B-29s had improved defensive armament and new tactics reduced the effectiveness of Japanese interceptors. They argued that the cost far outweighed the strategic gain. However, the Army Air Forces vehemently disagreed. The P-51 escorts flying from Iwo Jima did provide critical protection, allowing for more effective daylight precision bombing of Japanese industrial targets. And while the lives saved figure is debatable, many of those planes may have made it back to the Marianas or successfully ditched at sea. The psychological comfort and genuine refuge the island provided for bomber crews was immense. There is no simple answer. Kuribayashi's defense made the price so high that the island's strategic value would forever be questioned. What is undeniable is that the experience of Iwo Jima profoundly influenced American strategic thinking. It was the ultimate argument against a conventional invasion of Japan. The prospect of fighting a dozen Iwo Jimas on the Kanto Plain was a nightmare scenario that made the alternative, the newly tested atomic bomb, seem like a grimly logical, and perhaps even more humane, choice. The architect's legacy, a reevaluation and defeat. In the immediate post-war years, Tadamichi Kuribayashi was largely forgotten in Japan, a symbol of a catastrophic defeat. The IJA leadership that had overseen the war was disgraced, and their methods discredited. Traditionalists who had survived the war still quietly criticized his methods as defensive and unorthodox, a deviation from the true samurai spirit. However, as the decades passed and Japan re-examined its wartime history, a slow and complex re-evaluation of Kuribayashi began. His letters to his family were published, revealing the humane and cultured man beneath the general's uniform. Military historians, both Japanese and Western, began to study his defense of Iwo Jima not as a fanatical last stand, but as a masterclass in military engineering, psychological warfare, and innovative defensive strategy. They recognized that, within the hopeless strategic context he was given, he had performed with near-perfect tactical and operational brilliance. He had correctly analyzed his enemy's strengths and weaknesses, developed a revolutionary doctrine to counter them, and successfully instilled the discipline in his men to carry it out. He was no longer seen as just another suicidal commander, but as a tragic genius, a man who used his profound understanding of his enemy to orchestrate a defense of unparalleled lethality. In the United States, his legacy is one of respect and awe. To the Marine Corps, he is the ultimate adversary, the commander who inflicted their darkest hour and, in doing so, forged their most enduring legends of courage. Modern military strategists study his use of terrain, interlocking fields of fire, and defense in depth as timeless lessons in how an inferior force can inflict maximum damage on a superior one. He is the devil's architect, the man who turned a worthless piece of rock into a fortress that would forever be a benchmark for brutal, effective defense. Final echoes from the Sulphur Island. The battle for Iwo Jima did not truly end in 1945. The island remains a vast, unmarked graveyard. The bodies of over 12,000 Japanese soldiers remain sealed within the collapsed tunnels and caves, their commander's body among them. For decades, the island has been the site of joint U.S.-Japanese memorial services and recovery efforts, as teams work to repatriate the remains of the fallen. The tunnels, though heavily decayed and dangerous, are still there, a silent, subterranean testament to the labor and fanaticism of their builders. Unexploded ordnance from 1945 is still regularly discovered. The island is not open to the public, it is inhabited only by a small contingent of the Japan Self-Defense Forces. The scars on the landscape are still visible. Pillboxes rust away on the hillsides, and the black beaches remain. But the most powerful echo of Iwo Jima is in the historical memory it forged. It stands as a stark warning about the true cost of war, a brutal counterpoint to romanticized notions of glory. It demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of a defense based on attrition and the boundless courage of the men who were forced to overcome it. The story of Tadamichi Kuribayashi and his fortress is not one of victory or defeat in the conventional sense. It is a profound and disturbing examination of military innovation in the service of a hopeless cause, and a timeless reminder that on the path to total victory, the price can sometimes be so terrible as to be indistinguishable from defeat. The archives on this subject are now closed.